I'm hoping, well, actually, no, something. Okay. I was hoping I didn't need a microphone, but perhaps I do. First of all, I'd like to thank PGVIM for yet another incredibly stimulating topic for challenging one's imagination. And the only thing I know I'm not going to do this morning is to deliver a paper, because actually even when I woke up this morning, I've actually changed fundamentally some of the thoughts I wanted to share here, having experienced the audience yesterday and just wanting to reimagine some of this. But it's been a 3 or 4 month journey for me, stimulated by this topic, and it's the concept of music myth and reality has actually not only influenced what I want to share today here, but also is in fact influencing everything I think I'm doing from a reflective side this semester. So I'm working with one piece and then looking at ways in which one can take it in different directions, all of which at this moment in my time at least are meaningful to me, and I hope they may seed some interest and curiosity in others that music may move forward. Music, myth and realities, when I first saw it, the thing that hit me of course was the dualisms, and this idea that somehow myth and reality were opposite of each other. And since we've obviously seen the theme emerge, that it also becomes what happens in between. Yesterday we were talking about echo, and it struck me that dual has 2 meanings. The idea of the battle that potentially emerges between the myth and the reality. A colleague of mine was once giving a class about how to play 2 against 3. The Nigerian musician said to him, "I don't know what it is with you people in the West, why is it always a fight? It's actually 2 with 3. And it's quite interesting, if it was music, myths with realities, it would immediately become a different way of perceiving the same reality. So what I want to do is play with a whole set of dualisms, but then explore the realities they create, at least in my fantasy, for exploring one particular piece of music. So my first duality that hit me was, let's explore beauty and the beast. Partly because the theme of this came out at about the same time as the film. So it seemed quite entertaining to play with this. Going into this concept of one being immersed in the other, actually the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast is obviously fairly clear who is Beauty and who is the Beast. If one goes back in history, however, it becomes a little bit more confusing. So if you look at Cupid and Psyche, Psyche was extremely beautiful as one of 3 sisters, but if you looked at her character, if you looked inside her, one could argue that she was actually quite a bit of a beast, actually. She thought that no one was worthy of her love. Cupid, on the other hand, created a mythical challenge for an artist, which was he used to appear to her. Well, in fact, he didn't appear to her. He arrived as an essence, and ultimately she had his child, but she never knew what he looked like. And that sense of, is the beast a substance or an essence? So there was something beastly about the non-appearance of this person. Now, the story is incredibly complicated, and I won't get into it, and it has a very happy ending, as you can see from the bottom. So we have various artistic manifestations of Amore and Psyche, if it was in Italian, but for us it's normally Cupid and Psyche. I was interested in looking at this concept of beauty and beast, and then there's a recent Malaysian artist, Haris Rashid, who's actually done a series of paintings which looks at what is beautiful and what is beastly. But actually one of the things he's working with is the concept that actually we're killing beasts who are themselves beautiful. So who is the greatest beast in the process? So as you can see, this example here of stop killing the beast. So it's a theme that has been obviously around with us for a very long period of time. playing with what is beautiful. And one of the challenges I find in playing the piece or exploring the piece I want to share is how complex its beauty is. So if we go back to the Disney, there's a certain simplicity in the beauty, and actually there's beauty in simplicity as well. But actually, it sometimes becomes more interesting to explore complex beauties. Music and myth and reality. There are some myths. Have you come across them? We sort of tend to know when we see those pictures who I'm talking about. Who am I talking about? Who are these people? Please help me. Do you know their names? Mozart and Beethoven. Very good, very good. So obviously these are images of two people, and they're the iconic images of them. And we've formed a dualism in our understanding almost of classical music, of one of these almost being God and the other one being human. Or there's all sorts of dualisms that come into play. I think the truth is just so much more complex and interesting. So that's one of the places I want to start with today, one of our most inbuilt Western myths. The Telegraph in 2016 in the UK was very proud to announce that finally Beethoven had beaten Mozart in the top pop idol of 2016, and in the top 100 pieces that were played then, he won 19-16. It's like the Super Bowl. He had 19 pieces, Mozart had 16. And finally it was true. This guy that was always above us, this Mozart guy, had been supplanted by this guy who was really much more like us. And how much better we must feel. And so there was an entire article given over to The Guardian about how music had finally found its truth. I love the bottom bit there. He was a rule breaker, an iconoclast. What is an iconoclast? It's somebody who takes on the system, challenges it, and breaks it down and reimagines. What I want to share today is that was Mozart. So I'm going to be talking about Mozart, the rule breaker, and Mozart, the iconoclast. Which of course probably means he's a bit of a beast, because there must be something dark and negative about people who break down systems. So, I want to talk specifically about Mozart in 1785. In about 1781, Mozart decided to become effectively a freelance musician. He left his employer and decided he was going to effectively be his own business. We can write papers actually these days about Mozart the startup. And actually if you chart Mozart from 1781 to 1791 when he died, he could be a candidate for the typical form of 10 years of a startup industry. First of all, you don't have a clue what to do. You just hang around trying to make it work. Then suddenly you become immensely successful and you play with your apps. And the area I'm looking at present with Mozart more generally is him playing with his app between 1783-4 and about 1785. His app was the orchestra. And he worked out that actually if you brought the voice of the wind to have a more individualized identity, if you gave greater democratic possibility to sound in the orchestra, you could have constantly transforming sound walls. And if you look at his orchestral writing and his chamber music writing from about Herschel 449, which is a piano concerto for 2 oboes and 2 horns and strings with piano, obviously, through to the Marriage of Figaro. It's a constant shift in sonority. So people explore many other dimensions of Mozart's identity as an emerging composer, but exploring how he plays with his app is particularly interesting, I think. he had this amazing new piece of technology. It was called a forte piano. And he was still trying to work out what he could do with this thing. And of course he was improvising as much as he was composing. And we're fortunate we have some of his notated improvisations. But it would be really fascinating to be able to go back with our iPhones and record some of what might have been happening at the time. And we might have a very different image from the iconic image I showed you before. Anyhow, that's sort of one way of looking at Mozart. There are many ways of looking at Mozart. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about my experience with this particular piece, but also my experience with Mozart. I had a frightening realization as part of the preparation for this program, this performance. What is this? That I have now played the piece I'm exploring today for longer than Mozart lived. So I've been exploring it for more than his entire life. And I still don't have any answers. I'm about to play some of it. I don't actually know what I'm going to do with it. If you've been going to those lessons where you get told how to play pieces, let it go. It's much more fun when you don't know what's going to happen. It's much more scary as well. You can probably hear the nervousness in me as I think about it. But that's how it should be, I feel. It has to be live and now. Okay, I knew Mozart much more securely when I was 17 years of age. I played Mozart's A Major Sonata, Kochel 3. At the same time, I was, like Mozart in 785, I was doing a lot of gigs. And so I was also playing this. And then so if you're playing both of those two pieces at the same time as a 17-year-old, you wonder why you play Mozart. Today, when I woke up, I suddenly realized that piece was particularly interesting for this talk, because it's got a lot of little games in its harmonic progressions and in its musical journeying, which I think were quite profound. And it was incredibly interesting for me when I therefore, having played the A Major Sonata by Mozart, to come across the next piece I played by Mozart, which was the Fantasy in C minor, which I think today, from my perspective, is perhaps the most daring piece he ever put on paper. Last year when I came here, I shared with you the concept that one of the great things he did as a visionary, perhaps whether he knew or not, was to explore the birth of democracy through music with the idea of the quintet for piano and winds. So the wind instruments being able to sing like the king. The piano plays some themes, the oboe dares to play the same theme, and before you know it, they're in the discussion with each other in the introduction of the quintet. A great theme, which of course by the time of the French Revolution became something was of significance to the world through till now. With the fantasy, I think we get something even more interesting, which is the idea of expressing my doubts, my uncertainties, my individuality, my momentariness, exploring inside these sort of kingdoms of tonality that had emerged at the time, what might be possible if one explores sound. I should say, when I was a 17-year-old, I was more interested in having a Rhodes electric piano than a Steinway Grand. And Mozart was really interested in what the latest instrument was to come out. I realized in the last few months what a tragedy it is that for the last 38 years, whatever it was, I haven't been really playing with the transforming technologies of keyboards. I've been staying in a much more formaldehyde world, which is the Steinway sound. And even, I love the fact that Nord, or a Swedish company that make handmade instruments still today, make a red instrument rather than a black instrument. Because pianos weren't black, they've become black. Anyhow, it's a small point. I wanted to play you a little bit of a piece that I then discovered without knowing much repertoire. I was very lucky as a child. I got to improvise a lot and I learned a lot of theory, but I didn't know much repertoire. Somehow music has become repertoire and instruments. I'm hoping we might move back to music being music, which is the exploration through sound of what we can share with each other. It's not sound, it's what we do through sound. So I'm going to approach this piece now, which is called a fantasy. I'm going to play the opening, but I'm thinking of it more like Billy Joel than like Melvin Tan. Well, that's not fair to Melvin Tan, because he does improvise. What I'm seeking to do is to tell you its story, but to tell you its story, you need to know what he'd written before. So this journey of exploring alternative sonorities, directions, travel, where the diatonic hierarchies are being broken down by chromatic challenges and so on, is obviously a very different sonic world from the A major sonata I played before. So at the time I played that as a 19-year-old, so a similar sort of age to maybe where some of you are, this was like bizarre, peculiar. I couldn't really make sense of it, but somehow deep in my being it became extremely interesting. And of course the piece can't go on like that forever because it would be seen as potential madness. And indeed by this point in Mozart's life, as with any startup that's being successful, you begin to lose the plot and you begin to go perhaps a little bit into states which are seen by others as less sane. And so Mozart in 1785 was beginning to get that reputation. So I just want to very quickly trip through first performance when I was 19 or something. Then I moved to Europe. I'm looking at 37 years. Came across this concept more recently, of course, which has now been labeled as artistic research in music, but this idea that we should be reflecting through what we do at the same time as we do it, which of course we're always doing, but now it's articulating how we reflect it. I don't know why it became research. I sometimes wonder if it should be just called artistic resonances, or if it could be like Wittgenstein with philosophical investigations, maybe it could be musical investigations, but at present, the language we're using is artistic research. It gets me more interested in exploring some of these things. More recently still, or maybe actually before in fact, with people like Lecoq and Johnson and so on, it was embodied cognition, looking at roles of metaphor and how we think about what we do as artists potentially, although that wasn't maybe their focus, but it became mine. The first time I ever walked on stage, I have an artistic residency in France. The first time I ever walked on stage and decided just to flow with this piece as opposed to do what I should do, was actually in this artistic residency in La Wantaine, where somebody said something to me the moment before I walked on stage, and I thought, I'm just going with it. And it was probably relatively crazy to an audience listening to it who may know a different Mozart to that. And then, as you will see through some of this journey, current thoughts, which in turn, for example, maybe even get us rethinking how we play with each other on stage, and so on. How do we challenge conventions that have evolved over more than 200 years? I mentioned I wanted to go through a number of potential dualisms, the jewels of the dualisms. Obviously, beauty and ugliness, if we're doing Beauty and the Beast. Darkness and light. Order and chaos. Consonance and dissonance. Then and now. Sublime and disturbing. Timeless, momentary. Silence and sound. What's personal and what's public. What's natural and what's artificial. What is a performance and what is reflection? What is real? What is imaginary? Just the last two. Obviously, when we perform, what's going on in our head is real to us. It is therefore arguably reflection. We're not always fully conscious and control of it, and also we can reframe how we perform. So this, to a certain extent, is being conceived, at least in my preparation, as a performance. So it's a re-manifestation of a piece that was shared with us in the past. Finally, what is real and what is imaginary? Is our imagination real? Of course. Just before I go into it, the other thing that's happened in the 38 years is this beast that came along, which is internet, computers, technologies, and so on. And I just wanted to share very quickly how these have influenced my understanding of this particular piece in a very real way. So everything from being able to see so many different versions on YouTube, hearing so many different versions through Spotify, getting the concepts that other people have done by way of their reflections in referring to other music through CD-ROMs or through internet websites and so on. The possibility of technology, the fact that in fact the manuscript of this piece, which wasn't known in terms of its whereabouts when I first played it, came to light in the 1990s. So there's a whole pile of different energies that have made this piece constantly fresh, not only for me, but I think for many musicians across the world in this the last 30 years. It's been a piece through time, which has obviously excited very many different people in different directions. This is an analysis of it by Schoenberg as an example, because for Schoenberg, it almost became a political opportunity that you could start exploring the idea of uncertainty and chromatic transformations. Don't you think it's amazing? Look at the number of sharps, flats, and naturals in that release. So there's that version of it. There's the manuscript I mentioned before, which I want to point out one thing which I think is really wonderful. The piece, we're told is in C minor. But Mozart crossed out the key signature because he realized quite quickly that he was going to have to write a very large number of accidentals if he had it in C minor. So you can even see he starts crossing out the accidental he began to write. So one of the things you get is that Mozart always has really neat handwriting and everything comes straight from God and he wrote it down. And Beethoven, of course, was scribbling out all the time. Now we've got the manuscript. It's still pretty clean, but you can see something of thought process. So the idea of moving from sound to notation becomes absolutely interesting. I wanted also to say that, of course, the piece was written really for people just to play to themselves, not to play to it so much in a public context. It was written, in fact, for one of his students. So he wrote a number of pieces for her, but it's an important thing to understand how its context is constantly shifting. I gave you a whole pile of dualisms. What I want to do is to actually look at some of those dualisms in the context of this piece. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been looking for pieces of art which I thought began to share something of a potential vision I might work with in my head in attempting this music. So, sublime and disturbing, darkness and light. Well, I've played you the beginning before. I want to play a slightly different version of it now. Instead of thinking of an authentic instrument, what I began to explore was the concept of Mozart working with a new instrument and still trying to work out what was possible within it. One of the things I think contemporary digital pianos do, which are so much more exciting than when I was looking at the Rhodes or the Honors of the late 70s, is being able to mix sounds and begin to explore your inner imagination. What's underrepresented, I think, in classical exploration of the instrument, the forte piano obviously could do different dynamics. What was even more interesting potentially was it could do different resonances. So it had different sonority, almost like it could hold over time. So what I've done, this is a new instrument for me, and I've already decided it's the wrong instrument, so I'm going to move to the next instrument because the technology has shifted to a better thing even in the last 6 months. What I'm wanting to do increasingly is to explore what is it to play repertoire on a contemporary instrument with the concept that the one that they build in 5 years' time will be even better, and the composers should really be beginning to think about what they might do, not only in the pop world, but what they might do with the contemporary technology in more sort of reflective music. So what I've done with this is to mix a string quartet sonority into a piano sound. So you have a sort of Wüstendorf and Miese string quartet, effectively a piano quintet version, where there's a delay in the resonance from when the piano's onset is to when the strings come in. And then the delay of the strings will mean that those chords become sort of sound clouds. The sound is not brilliant. It does still sound a bit MIDI-like, I accept, because I don't fully know what I'm doing yet with this instrument. But I want just to get some experience of what happens when, instead of imagining mixes of sound, which all pianists are always told to do, what happens when you're actually beginning to experience it. That was the start. I want to move to a point where this becomes more meaningful. mixing sonorities, so you begin to imagine in your own head what you might be hearing rather than what's coming out of a set of speakers. So we begin to get into the concept that what one is meant to be doing, perhaps when one plays a piece, is something that's going on in one's inner world, rather than in the actual sounds in the room. And I think the potential for technology to begin to reimagine not only traditional pieces, but to reimagine what is possible today could be extremely exciting. This is from the first edition of the piece. Forte and piano obviously in conflict all the time, but the colors that become possible once you start exploring piano mixes, I think become even more interesting. Escaping out of all that piece, that chaos, if you like, we get to the first section, which is clearly diatonic. So we end up, we're in C minor, the first solid piece of extended 4-bar phrases that Mozart's famous for in D major. But to get there, we've actually gone through B major, a semitone lower, D flat major, a semitone higher, F sharp as a sort of augmented fourth clashing with this. And even the end that gets us into D major comes out of F sharp major chord. Piano piece to teach your students. 16 bars and nice compound binary form. 4-bar phrases, perfect harmonies. If you wanted to learn to improvise, this is a great piece to start. I actually was once frighteningly doing a performance and I suddenly thought I found a chord that I didn't remember before, and that was because I began to make it up. But actually I think sometimes with these pieces, we should begin to make it up. It can become too predictable. In contrast with that inner world, which is incredibly domesticated, Mozart at the White Week, what gets so often forgotten with that iconoclastic, with that the iconography, is this was a century of incredible conflict, and the sort of the close placement of the conflict and the sense of society was probably almost as real then as it is today. We're obviously living in a conflicted time, but I think maybe we've always lived in a conflicted time. And it was interesting having Dieter's explorations of time in Bali to just see how even in the perfect tonality there can be so many hidden challenges. So coming suddenly out of that world we were just in, the music transforming itself so radically. I think not only in its sonority, but also in its context, in our imagination. so quickly what is war, what is peace, in the context of the musical imagination through that very unstable passage. This is where we finally get a key signature, because it's sufficiently stable that we can be in B flat major for several pages. You'll see I've put there 3 different sets of dualisms. Then and now. The painting I've got there, obviously by Watteau, is from an earlier period than Mozart. It looks at the illusion rather as with the Bali example of what it is to be dancing in nature, what it is to be in a world which is the peasant world. But it's an illusion, it's not the reality of Mozart's time. He deliberately goes back and constructs a sort of stylized minuet. You probably heard a surprising degree of what sounds like dissonance within Mozart's writing earlier. Arguably, actually, this is the most sophisticated movement for dissonance of them all. I'll just show you very quickly 1 or 2. And this idea then of what is natural and what is artificial. So some of this music is obviously pouring out as a sort of flow of ideas. But we talk about natural phrasing being in a certain period of time in 4-bar phrases and so on. So here we are back in that flow, but how much of it, what of this imagination is real, what is artificial? The Bali example also very interesting in the idea of bringing in 3, 4 times. Would everyone like to count? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. What Mozart does through this passage, going back to the Nord piano or to the contemporary technologies, is amazing in terms of textures. So octave transpositions, which in one's imagination become much more diverse probably than one even hears them in the sonority. I just wanted momentarily to share the dissonance of this. For example, this passage. Or, for example, going back to the passage I just played. So a whole pile of 4/3 suspensions, 7/6 suspensions that are cast as if they belong to civilized society. There's a further section which again sends us out, I think, into, from my perspective, into a very different landscape, but of course another landscape that was beginning to become more dominant in the human psychology of the time, which is exploring the more challenging dimensions of the geography that surrounds us, heading off into the mountains. I'll skip that one very quickly and just leap to the end, because I think this, the last page of this piece in bringing all of this together, and again, I began with order and chaos, but this piece seems rather chaotic, but the degree of compositional order within it is extraordinary. Last week we had a solar eclipse. And for me, when this picture came out from NASA, it struck me that the last page of this piece is perhaps trying to look in a more timeless sense into the future. It's trying to look at getting above all of the material we've had in the piece and re-exploring it more with the idea that there can be ways of bringing such diversity together, as indeed the fantasy itself manifests. And I think one of the most exciting and beautiful things about the fantasy is Mozart chose to put it as a prelude to a sonata. In other words, this piece was not an end. This piece was meant to, its final cadence was meant to take us into a future. And so this concept of what is timeless, what is in the moment as we're listening to a piece. And obviously the other one I wanted to share very briefly is concepts of sound and silence, which we can tend to take extremely simply. But the potential for sound is across the entire range of the instrument. And there are moments in this piece where Mozart, I think, wants us to be as aware of the space, the silence between sounds, in terms of looking across the acoustic spectrum, as we are of the sounds themselves. So, sorry, just momentarily give you the music as well. One thing I find, finally, particularly fascinating about this piece is that, of course, in 1785, Beethoven was 15. So Beethoven was clearly extremely influenced by this side of Mozart's personality and output, so that this becomes one of the pieces that you can trace as influenced his C minor works throughout his life. At the time, Beethoven, of course, didn't know Mozart, but he was therefore on a journey of discovery. And I think sometimes when we look for pieces, as well as knowing the historical context, as well as knowing the language and so on, just this concept of coming to things with fresh ears, challenging what you hear recognizing that as students, for example, in a particular moment in your journey, that there's a long arc into the future, a phrase where things can evolve, and your awareness of what music can be and how you can share it with others can be constantly transforming. Where we are in Singapore at present, we're working with the tagline, which is listen in new light. And what I think we need to share, not only from a one institution's perspective, but in terms of how we engage with the societies that surrounds us, is wherever we are as musicians, how do we help the world to listen? There's a shortage, potentially, of listening in terms of evolution since the French Revolution, compared to what's happened in terms of our understanding of what we can do with our eyes, what we can do with our taste buds, what we can do with our feelings. So we need, as musicians, I think, to help take this forward by getting people to be able to connect with their fantasy. The more we connect with our fantasy, the way we move through rules to fantasy, the more we may be able to engage with others on that journey. So in terms of myth and reality, surely art is meant to make myth real. So let's explore the beauties and the beasts of our beings. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernard, for that very inspiring exploration of